So we're in 2 Samuel 17. At verse 24 will be our starting place as we pick back up in 2 Samuel. And we're going to see here today, as we get into this chapter, really the end of Absalom, the end of his rebellion, and this attempt to take over, essentially, the kingdom from David. We're also going to see, though, some true friendship traits as we look at this account, and some really awesome things there in the life of David. And so officially then, David's flight from Absalom ends today. Over the last several studies in 2 Samuel, we've seen David on the run. He's been chased by Absalom because Absalom basically, declared a coup, and then David had to run for his life. And then Absalom now is coming after him. And in the place of this chase, the fight that Absalom thinks he wants is going to happen, but it's not going to end the way he had hoped it would. So let's start in chapter 17, verse 24, 2 Samuel 17, 24. It says, "Then David came to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. Absalom set Amasa over the army in place of Joab. Now Amasa was the son of a man whose name was Ithra the Israelite, who went in to Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. And Israel and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. Now when David had come to Mahanaim, Shobi the son of Nahash from Rabbah, the sons of Ammon, Maker the son of Amiel from Lodebar, and Barzillai the Gileadite from Rogelim, brought beds, basins, pottery, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, lentils, parched seeds, honey, curds, sheep, and cheese of the herd, for David and for the people who were with him to eat. For they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. Then David numbered the people who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds." And so we see now here in 2 Samuel that the armies have gathered. First of all, we see Absalom's entourage, if you will. Absalom has this huge army that he's brought with him. If you look at verse 24 there, it says he and all the men of Israel with him. That's pretty intimidating. That's a pretty large group there to say all the men of Israel. And remember, Absalom followed Hushai's advice. And Hushai, back in chapter 17, said that don't go after David right away. That's what Ahithophel advised. Hushai said, no, wait, build up your force, get this huge army, and then go after him. And that's exactly what Absalom has done here. And Joab, is, of course, the commander of the army we're used to seeing in Israel. That's David's commander. Well, he's out now because he's with David, of course. And so Absalom appoints this new general, Amasa, in verse 25. And Amasa's mother is Abigail. And Abigail is the sister of Zeruiah, which is Joab's mother. This means that Amasa is actually another nephew of David's in all of this. Like Joab and Abishai, you might remember, are also nephews of David. And so this war is truly a family affair, isn't it? I mean, it's crazy to see all these relations going to be at war with each other. Like any civil war, it divides families. And so Absalom and his army here, they camp in Gilead, which was west of where David is in Mahanaim. And there's really no surprise attack here. I mean, he brings this huge army. They camp out overnight. Now tomorrow morning, let's go get him. Basically, is sort of the plan. Clearly, Absalom was very confident in the numbers that he had, just as Hushai told him he should be. Hushai said, you'll descend upon David and his men like the dew. Like they're just going to blanket them. There's going to be so many of you that they just can't get away. And remember, Hushai, though, was actually working for David. So his intent was to thwart the wisdom of Ahithophel that would have been successful had it been followed. Well, let's look at David's, digs, as it were, in all this. David is staying at Mahanaim, and that name is familiar to you if you've been tracking with us through 2 Samuel, or if you studied 2 Samuel at some point on your own time. Mahanaim was where Ishbosheth who was Saul's son that became king after Saul died, that's where he was camped at. That's where his palace was and such. This was his capital city there to the north. And David would have chosen Mahanaim now as a destination for him for a lot of the same reasons that Ishbosheth did. It was a safe distance away from Jerusalem, being the most important one. And that's obviously in Jerusalem is where Absalom and all the men originally gathered. And also as the former capital where Ishbosheth had reigned there for a few years, it would have had extra fortification that would have been helpful to David at this point, so that he would be protected from any, just raid, as it were, of Absalom's men. And so David is at Mahanaim, but we also see David is replenished there by some friends. And we learn a lot about people by their friends, don't we? We learn also by how people react when a person is in need and a person is suffering. We see here that David was a good man, and so all these people come to his aid. They come from all over, actually. We read of Barzillai, who is from Gilead. Now, Gilead is where Absalom is encamped. This is part of Israel, and so Barzillai would be an Israelite. We find out as we go further in 2 Samuel, he was a wealthy, elderly man. Makir from Lo-debar. Now, that name might sound familiar to you, because this is the man who was the guardian of Mephibosheth, who Mephibosheth, remember, was a descendant of Saul. He was actually Jonathan's son, who was lame in both feet because of an accident they had when he was a small child. And this is the one that David sought out, and he found him, and he said, I'm going to restore you from living in this obscurity with Makir. I'm going to restore you to being a prince of Israel, and gave him back the land of his father, and all these amazing things that David did for Mephibosheth. Well, now David's kindness there is being repaid to him, isn't it? We always talk about paying it forward in our society. Well, David didn't intend to, but he paid it forward with Mephibosheth. When he helped Mephibosheth, he didn't know that was going to end up being him being blessed then in the future by Makir, who had been Mephibosheth's guardian, who had seen everything that David did and now wanted to help David out. And then it mentions Shobi, and Shobi is the uncle of Amasa. And Amasa, I just mentioned, is now the commander of Absalom's army. So that's kind of interesting that, Amasa sort of made it here. he's achieved this amazing position as leader of this army, but his uncle says, no, I'm going with David. And he doesn't go with Amasa, his own kin. He goes with David. And Shobi, interesting enough, is not an Israelite. It says there he is an Ammonite. And yet, we see him wanting to come to help David too, which says a lot of David, that even someone who historically that nation would be an enemy of Israel, he's coming to help David also. And clearly reflecting a treaty that's already there, some peace that's already been achieved between David and the Ammonites. And so all of these bless David and his men with some much needed provisions. I mean, they bring food, they bring bedding and other supplies you can imagine that an army is going to need. And so the first lesson that we draw on true friendship, I think, is right here in these verses we just covered. And that is that friends help each other when they're in need. No one has to force this on us either, do they? No, there's no law that has to mandate that we help a friend when a friend is in need. It's natural for us to want to help our friends. Now, with COVID-19 going on all around the world right now, there's been much need in our world, isn't there? And it's been beautiful to see friends helping friends, and even strangers helping strangers in all this chaos that's been going on. But bringing it closer to home, here, it's been a blessing for me to see just in our church how there have been folks helping one another in this time, sharing supplies, sharing encouragement, and even humor via social media, and just lifting up one another in prayer. And just been so awesome. Even though we would never have asked for this terrible tragedy that's going on right now, there is a silver lining in just seeing how the body of Christ is ministering to one another. And so friends help each other. And one last point, though, about David's new digs here, as his army is dug in at Mahanaim, is that David's got quite a large following. I don't know if you picked up on that in chapter 18, verse 1 there. As we've been reading about David's exile, you kind of thought of it as a small group. I don't know if you thought of it that way, but you think of like maybe 50 people slipping out of Jerusalem and making their way up to Mahanaim. But clearly there were a lot of people there, tons of soldiers, not to mention all of their family also. I mean, David has set commanders here over hundreds and thousands, so he has quite a large army himself. Now, presumably much less than Absalom's, but not a tiny army, to say the least. And so the armies now have gathered. We have David's army, we have Absalom's army, and now the armies are going to engage in battle. So let's read a little more from 2 Samuel 18, verse 2. It says, David sent the people out, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I myself will surely go out with you also. But the people said, You should not go out. For if we indeed flee, they will not care about us. Even if half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore now it is better that you be ready to help us from the city. Then the king said to them, Whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and thousands. The king charged Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king charged all the commanders concerning Absalom. And so as the battle is about to engage, we see David has a battle plan. Not a surprise to us. David's proven to be a clever military strategist, all through 1 and 2 Samuel. And so his plan here is he divides his force into three parties here. Two of those parties, 2/3, will be led by Joab and Abishai. Those are familiar names to us. Those are David's nephews who have been military leaders with him for a long time now. And the other one is Ittai the Gittite. He's over the third, if you will, of David's army. And we were introduced to Ittai back in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 19. And following there, you remember that he's the one that David said, look, you haven't been here that long. You should just go home. Go back to your land. He's a Gittite. He's not of Israel. Take your family, go back home. This isn't your fight. And remember that Ittai was just so fiercely loyal to David. He's like, I'm with you. I'm with you, and I'm with your God. I'm not going to leave you, David. Whatever happens to you, that's going to happen to me too. And so it's such an awesome thing to see that. And, dividing up David's army like this was a smart tactic, of course, that David did. It would have given them a little more maneuverability, not being one large mass there, and a little bit less likely to be surrounded also by this larger force coming at them because they were broken up into three different groups and they could have some maneuverability. Now David wants to go with them, and why wouldn't David want to go with them? David, we know, is this accomplished warrior himself. Almost, immediately as we're introduced to him in the scriptures, it's, David and Goliath, right? I mean, we see that right away. And so we know he's an awesome warrior himself. But the people resist, and it shows how much they value David. They value him much higher than themselves. They say that he's worth 10,000 of them, even. And again, we see just the loyalty and the love of David's followers for him. And this is another trait that we see in true friendship. Friendship is marked with love and loyalty, like these have for David. Rather than abandoning David when he's down here, his friends are all coming to his defense, and they value him highly. Now, we're all familiar with the term a fair weather friend. And these are acquaintances in our lives that love us when things are going well. But when we are down, they are nowhere to be found, right? That's what happens. They're gone. We don't know where they went to when we need them most. Well, these aren't true friends, and we recognize that. This is not what a true friend does. But there's another saying that we have in our society, and that is that a friend in need is a friend indeed. And our friends are those who don't run when we are down. When we're in need and they stick around, we know they're really a friend of ours, don't we? And when we stick around in the lives of our friends, they know that we're really their friends. And, that doesn't mean that our friends are always going to be able to solve all our problems and, be Superman or Superwoman in our lives, but they want to help us walk through that. They want to be there to support us in prayer and in whatever way they can, just with the fellowship, to help us through that time. And so that's another trait of true friendship. But there's one last leg of David's attack plan I'd like to mention, and that was in verse 5 of 2 Samuel 18, and that is that David asks that they deal gently with Absalom. Basically, he wants them to bring back Absalom alive. David still loves his son, and even though Absalom has wreaked havoc on the kingdom at this point, David still loves him, and it's hard for us to understand, what was David really hoping for at this point? What is he hoping is going to happen with Absalom after this? I mean, things can never be the same now. I mean, Absalom has launched a full-on rebellion and taken over the kingdom like this. But David just is hoping beyond hope that his son is going to survive this, and somehow it's going to work out okay. Well, next, as we read more in our verses in 2 Samuel 18, we're going to see the rebellion gets a severe smackdown, starting at verse 6. It says, "Then the people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. The people of Israel were defeated there before the servants of David, and the slaughter there that day was great, 20,000 men. For the battle there was spread over the whole countryside, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured." And so, as Ahithophel had predicted, this delayed battle strategy works to David's advantage, not to Absalom's advantage. David now has been refreshed. David has been resupplied. David has a solid battle plan, and it's working. The losses are great here for the people of Israel, which when we see the people of Israel, again, that's a reference to Absalom's army. We see there that 20,000 were lost, which we assume is talking about of Absalom's army. And as you read it, it sounds like even the very trees fight against Absalom and his army. Because it says there in verse 8 that the forest devoured more people than the sword that day. Now, that may invoke in your mind a scene from The Lord of the Rings. That's not the intention here. That's not what happened. We don't have any trees actually grabbing onto people and fighting with them and this sort of thing. We do have them sort of grabbing on. We'll see in a minute, I guess. But it just shows that the terrain that they were fighting in was a tricky terrain and had a lot of pitfalls in it, and people died just from the actual terrain, trying to flee in the terrain and this sort of thing. And we see in that also the hand of God, though, don't we? That even the very nature itself, the place that the battle was on, fought against the enemies of God, which Absalom and his army were fighting against God's will. They were fighting against David, who was God's chosen leader of Israel. And so we've been talking about the land, of how it defeated so many. Well, in fact, the land captures the one who is the reason for all of this trouble. Let's look at verse 9 in 2 Samuel 18. It says, "Now Absalom happened to meet the servants of David, for Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak. So he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him kept going. When a certain man saw it, he told Joab and said, 'Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak.' Then Joab said to the man who had told him, 'Now, behold, you saw him. Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? And I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt.' The man said to Joab, 'Even if I should receive 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I would not put out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king charged you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Protect for me the young man Absalom. Otherwise, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof.' Then Joab said, 'I will not waste time here with you.' So he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And 10 young men who carried Joab's armor gathered around and struck Absalom and killed him. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained the people. They took Absalom and cast him into a deep pit in the forest, and erected over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, each to his tent. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself a pillar which is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to preserve my name. So he named the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. Now, if you've ever been hiking, or maybe you've been mountain biking, I like to mountain bike myself when the weather allows, maybe you found yourself like this in a set of dense trees, with their branches being so thick and so low you could hardly walk under them. This is the kind of predicament that Absalom found himself here on this battlefield. His mule passed under a tree like this. Now, depending on the translation you have, it may say it was an oak tree, or it may say it was a terebinth tree. The same word can be translated either way, and so that's why there's maybe a difference in your translation versus mine. It's actually the same Hebrew word being rendered there, but it can mean a terebinth or an oak tree. And so his mule passes under this tree, and Absalom gets caught in the branches because it's too low. Now think about that for Absalom. What a terrifying place to find yourself on the battlefield. I mean, you can't run because you're stuck in this tree. Your feet aren't even touching the ground. And you can't defend yourself either. I mean, you're just stuck there. This would be a terrible place to find yourself. And, we speculate a little bit that maybe that awesome hair, that Absalom was known for, maybe they got tangled up there and that didn't help him in this case. Maybe he should have cut it more than once a year, like it says he cut it once a year. Maybe if he had a good cut before this battle, who knows? Maybe he wouldn't have gotten stuck. But anyways, he got stuck. It was the Lord's will for that to happen. And Absalom's dilemma then gets reported to Joab. And Joab, he knows just what to do, doesn't he? I mean, Joab has no doubt what we're going to do about this situation. The man who tells Joab, though, he remembers David's request that Absalom's not to be harmed here. And so he insinuates that, if I harmed Absalom, you guys are just going to cut my head off. I know you, Joab. You're not going to stand by me if I did something like that. No matter what you're saying now, I know the truth. You weren't going to stand by me. But Joab, he has no such fear. Joab, remember, is David's nephew. And so David, we've seen, this isn't the best trait of David's, but David is clearly not keen on administering justice on his own relatives. So Joab's like, nothing's going to happen to me. If I kill Absalom, nothing's going to happen to me. David just doesn't want to do that sort of thing. He doesn't want to administer justice on his own family. Remember David's refusal to execute the death penalty on his son Amnon, all the way back in 2 Samuel 13. So it started this whole thing. It started this whole problem that's now exploded into a full-on revolution or rebellion in his kingdom. And Joab, too, also might have remembered that, once before I took my law into my own hands like this. Nothing ever came of that. Remember back in 2 Samuel 3 that he and his brother Abishai performed a revenge killing against Abner. Abner was this man who helped to really unify the nation under David. But unfortunately, when the nation was at war there for a little bit between Ishbosheth and David, Asahel, the brother of Abishai and Joab, he was chasing after Abner in one of these battles. And Joab, is running ahead of Asahel, and he keeps turning around saying, look, Asahel, you need to turn aside. This is not going to go well for you. I'm telling you, I don't want to hurt you. Turn aside. But Asahel would not do that, and eventually then Asahel was killed by Abner because he finally, ran out of breath, couldn't run anymore, and had to fight him. At that time, though, when they killed Abner in that brutal way, David refused to deal with the killing. He didn't do anything about it. He didn't minister any justice. And actually showed in 2 Samuel 3, verse 39, that David had a little bit of fear towards these guys. Now, we don't know if it was just fear of them personally or fear of the following they had, because these were these awesome military leaders in his nation. But he showed some fear there and an unwillingness to do anything. And so Joab now has no reserve about killing Absalom. He's like, nothing's going to happen to me. And so he kills him, and then they bury him. And ironically, he's buried under this crude pillar. This crude pillar is put over him. And it's reminiscent of a pillar that Absalom had vainly made for himself in his lifetime. Now, it says there in our verses, Absalom says that he had this pillar made for himself because he had no son to preserve his name. And so we assume that this was built early in his life, because when you look at 2 Samuel chapter 14 in verse 27, by that point, he has 3 sons. So at that point, he does have children, he does have sons in particular. Joab then blows the horn, which would be the signal to the army of David that, hey, the battle's over, you don't need to pursue anymore. And so Absalom's army then, they all, hear that too, and they say yes, and they just take off for their homes to get away from the battlefield in case someone changes their mind. Now, as much as we look at Joab, we think this guy's character is a little bit questionable. His action did save many lives that day. I mean, with Absalom dead, there was no reason to fight anymore, right? I mean, the rebellion and his kingdom died with him. And there was therefore no reason to pursue the army of Absalom anymore. And now the hope is that there will be reconciliation and no more fighting amongst the people of Israel. And so although perhaps, in the end, Joab did make a rational decision to end this conflict the way he did. In the end, it was not really the king's will, was it? The king didn't want Absalom to be harmed. So let's read more about that in 2 Samuel 18:19. It says, Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, Please let me run and bring the king news that the Lord has freed him from the hand of his enemies. But Joab said to him, You are not the man to carry news this day, but you shall carry news another day. However, you shall carry no news today, because the king's son is dead. Then Joab said to the Cushite, Go tell the king what you have seen. So the Cushite bowed to Joab and ran. Now Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said once more to Joab, But whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite. And Joab said, Why would you run, my son, since you will have no reward for going? But whatever happens, he said, I will run. So he said to him, Run. Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and passed up the Cushite. Now David was sitting between the 2 gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall, and raised his eyes and looked, and behold, a man running by himself. The watchman called and told the king, and the king said, If he is by himself, there is good news in his mouth. And he came nearer and nearer. Then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, Behold, another man running by himself. And the king said, This one also is bringing good news. The watchman said, I think the running of the first one is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, This is a good man, and comes with good news. Ahimaaz called and said to the king, All is well. And he prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground. And he said, Blessed is the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who lifted up their hands against my lord the king. The king said, Is it well with the young man Absalom? And Ahimaaz answered, When Joab sent the king's servant and your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was. Then the king said, Turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and stood still. Behold, the Cushite arrived, and the Cushite said, Let my lord the king receive good news, for the Lord has freed you this day from the hand of all those who rose up against you. Then the king said to the Cushite, Is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered, Let the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be as that young man. The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And thus he said as he walked, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. And so as we read these verses, David was looking for some news. David had stayed back at the request of the people so he would be safe. And we picture him all day sitting at a place where he might hear this conversation between the watchman and the gatekeeper and to know what was going on out there in front of them. Waiting to hear that a messenger was on the way. Like today, when we're waiting for some important news, we might sit there and stare at our phone, waiting for it to ring. Or with the things that have been going on around the world with COVID-19, we find ourselves watching endless news, hoping for some new tidbit, although it generally doesn't come, does it, until the next day. Finally, though, David hears of not one but two messengers approaching, and the first one is Ahimaaz, the son of the priest Zadok. And he's one of the two spies who brought David word to save his life back in chapter 17. So we've met him before. Ahimaaz wanted to bring this news to David. Now, we're not really sure why he wanted to do that. It doesn't say for sure. I mean, maybe he just wanted to, see the excitement on the king's face. But Joab was even puzzled about this. Like, there's not going to be a benefit to you to doing this. So I don't understand why you want to do this. Of course, he didn't know that Ahimaaz was going to take a shortcut and get there first. He thought the Cushite would get there first, but Ahimaaz knew a way to get there ahead of time. And when he gets there, though, you notice how in verse 29, he can't bring himself to tell David the full truth there. He doesn't tell of Absalom's death. Joab's plan instead was for the Cushite to go and tell David. This would be not an Israelite. He was a Cushite, which we think of as Ethiopia today. It's from Ethiopia. And this man has no trouble telling David that his son is dead, in verse 32. And obviously the Cushite doesn't know something that we know and that Ahimaaz and Joab would have known, and that is that David has a history of not responding as people expect to the death of his Israelite quote-unquote enemies. You think about when the Amalekite came and told David in 2 Samuel 1 that King Saul had been killed. It didn't end the way he expected. He said, yes, I gave the death blow to him. It's like, okay, well, here's your death blow. He got executed. And then you remember that there were two Israelites who murdered Ishbosheth to end his reign. And that was in 2 Samuel 4. David executed them as well. And so, David doesn't always respond the way people think he will to the death of his enemies like this. And so Joab may have thought, better this Cushite to die than Ahimaaz. Not that we want the Cushite to die. He seemed to have been a trusted man also in David's kingdom, but it wasn't Ahimaaz, the son of a priest. So he didn't want the son of this priest to die. Well, David's questions, though, to these messengers shows where David's heart is in all this, doesn't it? I mean, immediately his concern is for his son. That's what he wants to know, is what's happened with Absalom. The fact that the battle is won seems like David just sort of assumed that would be the case, doesn't it? Which either speaks of David's great faith or maybe even indifference to the fact that they won. David's reaction then to Absalom's death is terrible grief. And this is understandable, of course. I mean, he lost a son. And grief is largely an involuntary response. It's not one that we really control, how we respond in grief. We don't know how it will hit us until it does. And experts tell us the most important thing is that we do grieve, when we go through a period of loss. But unfortunately, in David's case, his grief is affecting more than himself, because it's a very touchy situation he's in. But once again, we're going to see Joab knows just what to do. So let's read from chapter 19 now, and these will be the last verses we look at today. Chapter 19, verse 1 of 2 Samuel. It says, Then it was told Joab, Behold, the king is weeping and mourns for Absalom. The victory that day was turned to mourning for all the people, for the people heard it said that day, The king is grieved for his son. So the people went by stealth into the city that day, as people who are humiliated steal away when they flee in battle. The king covered his face and cried out with a loud voice, Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Then Joab came into the house to the king and said, Today you have covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who today have saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives and the lives of your concubines, by loving those who hate you and by hating those who love you. For you have shown today that princes and servants are nothing to you. For I know this day that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. Now therefore arise, go out and speak kindly to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, surely not a man will pass the night with you. And this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now. So the king arose and sat in the gate. When they told all the people, saying, Behold, the king is sitting in the gate, then all the people came before the king. I'm just going to stop there. We're actually going to pick up in that verse next time we're together. And so we see here, of course, that David is a grieving father. He has lost his eldest son. But David also has living wives and children, and David is a king. And so David's grief is sending a message that he loved Absalom more than all these others, that Absalom was more precious to him than everyone else, such that people are feeling ashamed for rescuing David, as though they had gone against his will. I mean, he didn't want them to save him. He wanted to die, is what he's communicating. It's as though David was saying that he wished all of them were dead too, is what Joab says in verse 6 there, instead of Absalom. Now, we feel for David in his grief, but at the same time, David was taking all these others for granted, wasn't he? As Joab said, he basically was treating them like garbage, is what he's really doing. Not thinking at all about how they would feel at this point in time. And, this is a mistake that we can make too. A mistake that we can make of essentially playing favorites or having favorites. How must this have felt to David's surviving family, that he would rather die than lose Absalom, when David's death would have meant their death also? We saw the people were filled with shame. We must have assumed his family just felt the same way or felt even worse. And I just want to point out that as parents especially, we can't allow ourselves to have favorites like this. Whenever this happens, it's always traumatic to those who are not the favored one. They might despise it. They might despise the fact that they're not favored and act out then in ugly ways. We remember in the book of Genesis, Joseph's brothers, in their jealousy, selling Joseph as a slave because he was the favored child. Or perhaps worse, those who are not favored may internalize it and suffer with feelings of inadequacy for their whole lives. Going through life always feeling like they don't quite add up, that they don't quite matter because mom or dad didn't love them quite as much as they did another sibling. And so rather than having favorites, we must love and value each one for the unique person that God has made them. Now, that's even in those times that they may not be living up to their best. They may not be doing all that we wish they were doing or living the way we wish they were living. Now, we're not going to encourage that sin, but we're not going to, as they say, throw the baby out with the bathwater. We still love and value this person, even though we may not like the behavior at the moment. And so once again, Joab comes to David's rescue, doesn't he? Joab, great Joab here. At this time, he does it with honest counsel. Though Joab is a bit rough around the edges, you can't deny that, he is a true friend in the end. And don't we all want someone like Joab in our lives? Someone who has our best interest at heart. Someone who loves us enough to tell the truth. Even perhaps risking the friendship by doing so. Now, Ahimaaz was another friend of David's, but he wasn't willing to do that, was he? He only wanted to tell David good things, to the point that when David asked him a direct question about Absalom, he lies to him. Ahimaaz was there when Absalom died. He knew exactly what had happened, but he lies and says he doesn't know what happened. That's not a true friend, is it, at that point, when he won't speak the truth to him, even though it's a difficult thing to hear, but the thing that David needed to know. Now, in terms of speaking the truth in love, which is what we're talking about, I've been on both sides of this in my life, and maybe you have been too. I've been in friendships where truth had to be spoken like this. I've been on both sides. And, in all those cases where I'm thinking of that it occurred, the friendship not only survived this having to do this, but it grew as a result. And ultimately, it points both people back to the Lord, which is what we want, back to the standard of truth. And so it's actually an awesome thing when it takes place. There's a saying that, the best way to have a friend is to be a friend. And so I just encourage us to be a Joab for other people in our lives. I'm not suggesting we butt in where we don't belong. I'm not suggesting we be busybodies, but we have the best of others in mind. And should God put something on our heart concerning our friends, should God reveal some sin, is what we're talking about in our friend's life, that we be willing to share with them about that. Tactfully, though, in the way that we're commanded to do so in Galatians 6, verse 1. I'll read Galatians 6, verse 1. It says, "Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted." And so that's what friends do, don't they? They share the truth in love. Well, today, as we've been studying in 2 Samuel, we've seen the end of Absalom's revolt and the end of Absalom himself. But we've also seen some traits of true friendship here. We've seen that friends help each other. We've seen that friends don't abandon each other in difficult times. And we've seen that friends are willing to speak the truth in love. All of us want to have at least one friend with these traits in our lives, don't we? And my exhortation to all of us is let's be that friend. And so let's close our time then with a word of prayer. Lord Jesus, we're so thankful to you again for your word and how your word speaks to us and how we see such godly examples of how we're to live in your word. Even in a chapter like this, which is full of revolution and war, we see, God, these traits of friendship. And God, we pray that you would help us by your power to be those friends who are willing to speak the truth in love, who have the best of our friends in mind. Lord, help us to be those friends that don't abandon our friends when they have need, but we stick together and we help one another. And Lord, we know that we can only do these things by your power. We ask for that power today and this week and every day in our lives. Help us to be the believers that you would have us to be. Help us to walk closely with you and minister to those you bring into our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.